Hello, beautiful people, and welcome! Hello! To a video about the upcoming free 5-star standard character selector. I want to quickly talk about each of the standard characters, their pros, their cons as in like negatives, and cons as in constellations. So let's get right into it. We can start with the original 5. The original 5 standard 5-star characters back in 1.0, with the knowledge we have now, were not very good, but many of them got better through obtaining new options later on. We're gonna start with the one that didn't get better, or rather, that improved the least, which is Qiqi. Qiqi is like the epitome of losing your 50-50. When people think losing their 50-50, they think Qiqi. And there's a reason for that. It's because she's the worst one out of them. That doesn't mean that she's not usable in any team, but rather what it does mean is that there's not really any team where she's optimal. Back at the very start of the game, her healing was at least like significantly higher than the alternatives. Like back in 1.0, if you were looking at healing options, pretty much every single unit had some sort of downside when it came to healing. Barbara is Barbara. Bennett couldn't heal you if you're above 70% HP, so you had to manage your health a little bit more carefully. Jean doesn't really have as much of that weakness, but she is still at least unable to heal you like properly without her ult. She does have some healing in her normal attacks, but she's reliant on her ult to be useful in terms of healing. And Qiqi's ability to heal you with her skill or her burst or a lot was enough to make her feel like a nice way to get defensive utility back when it was hard to invest in a lot of characters at once, because the numbers on her healing were high enough that you didn't need a lot of investment into her for her to do a decent job at healing. With the game developing with time, that's lost a lot of value. She has gained the ability to convert some of her healing to damage with the Lamb set, and I guess to some extent also the other healing set, the one that's in the same domain as the Navia set. But the reality is that Qiqi just pretty much all she provides is healing. She has a little bit of off-field cryo application, but her ICD is awful, so it's very slow. She doesn't generate any particles, which is something that only a few characters don't do. She tends to have awkward uptime because of her 30-second cooldown. You can fix that with Sack, but you don't really care enough about it, not just to run Sack when you could instead run a weapon that actually makes her do something like Fav. All in all, Qiqi just isn't a particularly good unit. None of her constellations really change that. They slightly increase her damage and her survivability, but they don't increase her damage enough for it to matter, and the survivability increase doesn't matter because she already gives you enough. Overall, Qiqi is definitely the worst of the 5 characters. Outside of Qiqi, I think that there is a reasonable argument for honestly any of the remaining 6, right? The 4 that weren't available in 1.0, or the 2 that have been added to the standard banner afterwards. When I say reasonable, I don't necessarily mean that I can conceive of an account where it's going to be optimal, but rather I can conceive of a person who would like the character enough for it to be a reasonable option to go for. So I guess next we can talk about Diluc. Diluc is a bit of a weird case because he got a pretty big upgrade with Xianyun coming out, giving him a plunge, like an actual plunge team that doesn't rely on Dragon Strike. But his constellations don't really increase the damage of those plunge teams. And even with all of his constellations, he's stronger in the plunge teams than he is in his normal teams. Technically, there can be situations where it will be stronger to play him in the normal teams if you can pull off Dragon Strike and actually get plunges anyways. But most of the time with Xianyun's release, he's just a plunge attacker for her. There are people who make non-Xianyun Diluc teams work, and it's honestly pretty cool to see, because like you can tell, like pulling off Dragon Strike in those teams is incredibly difficult. You can tell how good the people playing it are, but it's not something I would recommend to someone who wants a strong team, because I don't think that the return that you get for the effort is worth it compared to pretty much any other character that's difficult to play. Also, with the release of Gaming, if you have him at high constellations, he can just be straight up better than Diluc. So overall, Diluc is a character, if you like him, you can make him work, and he has some actually relatively strong teams, but he's definitely not a character I would recommend to someone who doesn't particularly like him. Next, we can talk about, I guess, Keqing. Keqing is probably the character who got the biggest upgrades. Maybe not the biggest, but one of the biggest upgrades since 1.0 in terms of power with the release of Dendro in Sumeru. Keqing is not a particularly strong character. She doesn't have particularly good multipliers. What she does have is pretty good electro application, which before Dendro's release didn't really matter, but post Dendro means that she can trigger Aggravate a lot, and she can proc Fischl's Ascension passive a lot. Keqing is not the best character in Aggravate. I think it's pretty fair to say that with Clorin's release, we now have characters that are better than Keqing is in almost every way. Enough so that I would say that Keqing is a worse character overall. I don't think there's too much of an argument otherwise. But obviously, just because the character exists doesn't mean you have it. And her teams are still actually relatively strong, and definitely more than strong enough to play Abyss. She's not really reliant on her constellations, but her constellations do help her. Her C1 is fine. Unfortunately, it shares ICD with the skill itself, so it doesn't actually get you one more Aggravate. Her C2 is quite useful. There used to be a bug where if you triggered the effect, if you attacked with a normal or charge attack during the effect's cooldown, it would reset the cooldown to 5 seconds without giving you a particle. So as long as you kept attacking, you would only get the first particle and that would be it. It used to be bugged that way, but they fixed that bug, and now it's a relatively good constellation. It just gives you some energy. It's not, I don't know if I'd say that it's worth going for like on its own, but if you really like her and you want to play her a lot, then it's gonna be a nice one to get. Her C3 and C5, because she's a character that does so much of her damage with aggravates, don't really do too much, but it's still fine because it gets you a little bit better AoE coverage because your burst is a good portion of your AoE damage. Her C4 is just 25% attack. Nice little stat boost that doesn't do too much, but does help. And then her C6 is some damage percent, also a nice little stat boost. There's a bit more than her C4, but it's not an insane C6. Overall, the difference between C0 and C6 is noticeable, but it's not so huge that she's a great character at C6 and a bad one at C0. I'd say that she's a good character at C0 and a slightly better than good character at C6. Next up, we have Mona. Mona is a character that doesn't really do anything other than give a buff, and the strength of her buff is okay. It is definitely a stronger buff than most characters that both give a buff and do something else, right? She gives about 60 damage percent, which is good. And then if you manage to put her on TDDS, she also gives 48% attack, which is also good. But the duration of her buff isn't very long, and there are a lot of teams where you just can't generate enough energy to be able to run TDDS, and you have to use an energy weapon instead, be it Prototype Amber or Favonius. That being said, she actually has constellations that help her as a support, which are kind of useful. Her two big constellations are her C1 and her C4. Her C1 is bugged. The part that says frozen duration is extended by 15%. This is a lie. It actually does literally nothing for frozen. I think they just forgot to code this in. I've seen people who don't understand how auras work say that, oh no, it just depends on the order. No, frozen duration does depend on the order. That is true. However, if you do things in the same order at C0 and C1, it will be the same duration. So the frozen part doesn't do anything, but the vape part is actually pretty useful if you're playing her in vape teams. Her biggest issue though is that she's not really good enough to find a place in any strong teams. She's playable, but you shouldn't expect too much out of her. C2 doesn't really do anything. It increases her value as a damage dealer, but even at C6, she's a pretty bad damage dealer, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah, C3 gives you ult levels, which doesn't actually increase the damage you get from the ult. The damage buff you get stops increasing after level 10, so it's only the bubble explosion damage itself that gets increased. C4 makes it so that her buff, or her bubble also gives 15% crit rate, which is quite useful. C5 is skill damage, which is worthless. C6 increases the charge attack damage after you've spent time in your dash. It's pretty bad. Overall, her meaningful constellations are C1 and C4. I think Mona is a unit that she really doesn't see much play. The only team where she tends to actually see play are Ayaka teams, or I guess Ganyu teams, just freeze teams in general. But one, there's a lot more alternatives to her now. Two, when you look at her constellations, they don't really do anything for freeze teams. C1 is bugged for freeze, and C4 gives crit rate, which is a stat you're very likely to already be almost overcapped on in freeze teams. Yeah, that's true. Mona can also be good with Dehya carry, but ugh. All of that being said, she does give a pretty big buff that is nice for your screenshot numbers if that's all you care about. She still can have some value through that. And the last of the starting of the 1.0 standard 5 stars is Jean. I think out of the 1.0 standard 5 stars, Jean is probably the one that's aged the best. What she does is incredibly straightforward. She is an animal unit that is also a healer, and that's kind of it. That's pretty much all she does. You do have some cheese you can do with fall damage with her skill by holding and aiming it upwards, and then weaving in some charge attacks and slamming enemies down. There is some things you can do with that, but all in all, it's not really that significant. Mainly, what she is just an animal character that's a healer. VV is such a strong set that having an animal character on your team tends to be really useful, and being a healer gives her an edge over some of the other animal characters. Generally, she's not really better than Xianyun, because Xianyun is also a healer, but additionally also has some upside that makes her necessary for some teams. But Xianyun's a limited character, and we're talking about potentially getting a standard 5-star for free. So mainly Jean's value is if you want to play her in arena teams where you need VV. She has the ability to self-apply Animo, which does give her some niche use case in some teams where you trigger reactions on yourself, which people generally refer to as Sunfire. You apply Pyro to yourself, and then you apply Animo, and that swirls and does a nice little AoE of Pyro around you. Sunfire is a cool interaction, but it's not particularly strong. It's useful in some Ganyu teams because the strength of the Pyro Aura applied by Sunfire is stronger than the Pyro Aura applied by other sources of off-field Pyro, like Xiangling, which can make it useful if you want to melt multiple different sources of damage. Having a stronger Pyro Aura lets you do that. But most of the time, she won't be in your team for the Sunfire. She'll be there just because she's an animal healer. When it comes to her constellations, C1 does nothing. C2 is move speed, which also does nothing. Technically, this can be useful for Dragon Strike. This can give you the movement speed that you need in order to be able to jump high enough during hit lag with Dragon Strike to do a plunge attack, but it's not really significant in most situations. The attack speed also generally doesn't really do too much, but it can be somewhat useful. C2 is kind of just whatever. C3 ult levels, meh. C4 is pretty much the only one that I think is really worth talking about. 40% animal res shred is good. However, Farazan's release made this a lot less significant. It used to be that the only way to shred animal resistance was either like Venti constellations or Zhongli, or this. And this was the biggest res shred out of them all. But with Farazan's release, we got another source of animal res shred that also gives buffs to Animo, which at C6 are bigger than what you get from Jean being there. Yeah, there was also Animo Traveler, but like, whatever. What that means is that in terms of like how much damage you get out of this, the Animal Res Shred from her C4 is less useful than Farazan's kit, and Animal Res Shred doesn't stack too well with more of itself. But even despite that, if that were the only issue, it would still be pretty good, just because, well, it's still a pretty big Res Shred buff, or Res Shred debuff. What really stops this from being all that good is that this doesn't have a duration. It is only within the field created by Dandelion Breeze. Jean's ult is not that big, and the enemy has to be in it. It's not a buff, it's a debuff. And it's a lot harder to keep an enemy in a circle than it is to keep yourself in a circle, especially when her ult itself pushes enemies away when you cast it. It's very, very difficult to keep non-boss enemies inside the circle, which makes the versatility of this kind of ass. C5 doesn't really do too much, and then C6 gives you damage reduction inside your ult. I'd say that her C6 is useful. It's nice to get, but it doesn't give you anything offensively, and you have to get a lot of constellations in order to get it. Next up, I want to talk about Dehya, and I'm talking about Dehya before Tighnari, even though she got released after, because I want to leave the strongest one for last. Dehya, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is not a particularly strong character. However, Hoyo has something against Pyro. I don't know what it is. It's a deep-rooted hatred for Pyro characters that aren't specifically just an on-field damage dealer, or Bennett, or Xiangling. The reality is that your options when it comes to Pyro characters that aren't just straight-up Xiangling, Bennett, or you're an on-field damage dealer, like if you need Pyro for your team for some reason or another, all of them have issues. And because of that, even though Dehya has definitely her fair share of issues as well, there are situations where she's still somewhat useful. Specifically, Hoyo has given us a lot more characters, or a lot more off-field characters that either don't provide a buff themselves or provide a buff that lasts for a very long time, which is good for Dehya because one of Dehya's issues is that the duration of her increased interruption resistance is kind of short, and so if you have to start with her because your buffs also have a short duration and you want to use your buffs right before your uptime, then it almost just expires before you swap onto your on-fielder. When you're given characters like support characters or off-field characters that either have a really long buff duration like Farina or do damage without actually providing a buff with a specific duration like Emily or Chiori, and I'm not saying that Chiori is good with Dehya, but that sort of design decision alleviates Dehya's uptime weakness a little bit more. It makes it easier to justify swapping to Dehya right before your carry. Overall, Dehya is the standard character that gains the most from C0 to C6 by a pretty large margin. I think it's triple the damage from C0 to C6, which is significantly more the other standard characters. However, in terms of being a carry, her power at C0 is pretty far behind the other standard characters. I think that if all of them are at C0, Dehya is definitely a weak carry compared to Keqing or Diluc. If all of them are C6, I do think she's stronger than them. C6 Dehya is, in terms of power, about equivalent to a C0 or maybe even a C0 and a half limited character, which isn't that bad. But obviously that's at C6. At C0, as a carry, she's very bad, but she does have some use case as a defensive option in Linny teams, in Nevilette teams, in the upcoming Kanich teams once he comes out, in upcoming Molani teams once she comes out. So I do think she got a bit better with time so far at C0, but again, one of the biggest reasons why she still sees play is because your other alternatives when it comes to off-field Pyro are not great. It's more so due to a lack of other units in a similar slot than to a strength of her own. So I would be careful going for her just for a team like that. I think it's something you should be aware of before you make your decision at least. But yeah, constellations individually. C1 is okay. C2 helps her a lot when it comes to off-field Pyro app in teams that don't necessarily need fast Pyro app, but do need it to last longer. Her C2 helps a lot because it increases its duration. You don't increase the duration of the unlimited resistance to interruption that you get for the first 9 seconds of your skill, but you do increase the duration of the slightly increased resistance to interruption that you get for the rest of it. So that's at least some more utility defensively. C3 is the ult levels. It's okay. C4 is energy and healing on her ult. It's okay. C5 is damage on her skill. It's okay. And C6 is really good. Definitely the strongest individual standard character constellation when it comes to like their own strength. I think it would be fair to argue that Jean C4 is more valuable if you're playing her in a specific Animo team. But in terms of like how much it increases her strength out what she does already, it's definitely the strongest of the five-star constellations from the standard banner. And it's the main reason why she gets so much stronger from from C0 to C6. Obviously, all that she gains from her C6 also retroactively makes the constellations that increase the damage on her ult more valuable. All in all, if you want to go for Dehya, you should either try to get to C2 and then not bother, or try to go all the way to C6. Finally, we have Tighnari. At C0, out of all of the standard characters, I'd say he's probably the best. You can make an argument that Keqing competes with him, but it's really hard to compare them one-to-one because so much of the strength of Keqing teams comes from Fischl being broken, so it's hard to attribute that to Keqing herself. However, what makes Tighnari an interesting standard character isn't that he's arguably the strongest to begin with, it's that he's arguably the strongest to begin with, and arguably has the second best constellations after Dehya on the standard banner. I think if you're going for like just the strength of your account and that's it, the optimal character to get is for almost everyone going to be Tighnari. If you think about it short term, he's a fine character to have, but if you think about it long term, having C6 Tighnari is pretty damn good. C6 Tighnari is arguably better than C6 Dehya, and he's going to also be significantly better than her every step of the way as you're getting there, if you're comparing C0 to C0, C1 to C1, C2 to C2, etc. Almost all of Tighnari's cons are like decent incremental increases, right? C1, 15% crit rate on charge attacks, alright. C2, 20% general damage, alright. C3, burst levels, it's alright. C4, full team EM buff, it's alright. C5 is probably the worst one, it's kind of not great. And then C6, pretty good. His C6 is also a very strong constellation individually, but his, outside of the talent constellations, his constellations on the way there are all going in the same direction of just making him do a bit more damage. Overall, I think that for most people, the optimal character to get from the standard selector is going to be him. Personally, I don't care. I am not going for him because I am going to go for Dehya, and in 5 years, I'm gonna have C6 Dehya. I think Dehya is a cool character, and I think it's a shame that she sucks, and I don't want her to suck, so I want to get her at C6. So yeah, I'll see you guys in 2029. Yeah. In terms of how I would value them, for a new player, I would say that either Tighnari or Keqing is probably the way to go. For a slightly older player, or a player that already has a few characters on their account, but that doesn't have the standard characters yet, I'd say that it's probably either Dehya or Jean, just because they help you round out your teams in useful ways. And then for people that already have all of the C0 standards and that are just looking to get constellations, Tighnari first, then Mona, but only if you use her, then Dehya, then honestly whatever. So that's all I wanted to say for the standard characters. It's nice that we get a selector. Feels a little late because I finally got my first Qiqi and then my second and third Qiqi in the past few months. So I probably would have gotten her if I didn't get her from the banners, but I mean, it is what it is. At this point, I would probably, in terms of strength, I'd probably get a lot more out of a 5-star weapon standard selector, but it is what it is. Or rather, even better, 1 5 sword. God, I would do anything for 1 5 sword. But yeah, anyways, that's gonna be it for the video. And as usual, make sure you like, subscribe, all the good stuff. Let me know in the comments which character you're gonna get and why. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.